beautiful native widow begged shelter for one night, but rancher gave her forever of protection. The winter wind howled across the Montana plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bite of snow and the promise of a harsh night ahead. The year was 1892, and the small ranching community of Silver Creek had learned long ago that survival in this unforgiving land required both strength and compassion in equal measure. Thomas Mackenzie stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. At 42 years old, he had spent the last 15 years building his cattle ranch from nothing more than determination and calloused hands. His weathered face told the story of countless days under the brutal sun and freezing winters. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years earlier from fever, leaving him alone with his memories and his work. The ranch had become both his purpose and his prison, a place where he poured all his energy to avoid the emptiness that waited in the quiet moments. The ranch stretched across 500 acres of grassland and rolling hills. Thomas employed 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse near the barn. They were good men, hard-working and loyal, but they kept to themselves mostly. The main house, a sturdy structure built from pine logs, stood silent, except for the creaking of wood and the occasional snap of the fireplace. Thomas had grown accustomed to the solitude, though there were nights when the silence felt heavier than any burden he had carried. On this particular evening, as darkness began to swallow the land, Thomas noticed something unusual on the horizon. A figure moved slowly along the dirt road that led to his property. At first he thought it might be one of his ranch hands returning from town, but the silhouette was wrong. This person moved with an unsteady gait, stopping frequently as if gathering strength for each step forward. Thomas squinted against the fading light, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that leaned against the porch railing. Life on the frontier had taught him caution. Strangers could mean trouble, and a man alone had to protect what was his. But as the figure drew closer, Thomas realized this was no threat. The person was small, wrapped in a tattered blanket that whipped in the wind, and clearly struggling against the elements. He stepped down from the porch and walked toward the approaching stranger, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman, and she was not alone. She carried something pressed against her chest beneath the blanket. When she finally looked up at him, Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. She was a native woman, probably in her late 20s, with dark eyes that held both fear and desperate hope. Her face was beautiful despite being marked by exhaustion and cold. Her long black hair, partially covered by the blanket, was tangled from the wind. But what struck Thomas most was the bundle she carried. A small child, no more than 2 years old, was wrapped in the remaining fabric, the tiny face barely visible. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper, broken by shivering. "Shelter. We will leave at sunrise." Her English was clear but accented, each word carefully chosen. Thomas could see she was using all her remaining strength just to stand before him. The child had not made a sound, which worried him more than if it had been crying. He had seen enough of life to know that silence in a child often meant danger. "Come inside," Thomas said immediately, reaching out to steady her as she swayed. "Quickly, before you both freeze." The woman hesitated for just a moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of threat. Thomas understood her caution. A native woman alone with a child, asking help from a white rancher, had every reason to be afraid. The stories of what happened to her people were well known, and trust was a luxury few could afford. "I mean you no harm," Thomas added gently. "My name is Thomas Mackenzie. You and your child need warmth and food. Come." Something in his tone, or perhaps simply the desperation of her situation, made the woman nod. Thomas guided her toward the house, one hand lightly on her elbow to keep her steady. She walked as if every step caused pain, and he wondered how far she had traveled and what she had endured to reach his door. Inside the house, the warmth from the fireplace immediately began to thaw the frozen air that had followed them in. Thomas quickly pulled a chair close to the fire and helped the woman sit down. She clutched the child tighter, as if afraid someone might take the little one from her arms. "Let me take your blanket," Thomas offered. "I'll get you something warm and dry to wear." The woman shook her head firmly. "The child," she whispered. "Please, the child first." Thomas knelt down to get a better look at the bundle. The little girl, for he could now see it was a girl, had her eyes closed. Her lips had a bluish tint that spoke of dangerous cold. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. "I need to warm her up," Thomas said, his voice urgent but calm. "May I?" After a moment of hesitation, the woman nodded and carefully unwrapped the child. Thomas took the tiny body in his large, rough hands and began to rub warmth back into her limbs. He had done this before with newborn calves caught in spring blizzards. The principle was the same: restore warmth gradually, stimulate circulation, and pray you were not too late. "What's her name?" Thomas asked as he worked, trying to keep the woman focused and alert. "Little Dawn," the woman replied, tears beginning to stream down her face. "Her name is Little Dawn. She is all I have left in this world." "And your name?" Thomas continued, wrapping the child in a clean, dry blanket he pulled from a trunk near the wall. "I am called Sarah," she said. "Sarah White Eagle." "That was my married name. My husband gave me the English name when we married," he said. "It would make things easier with the white settlers." "Your husband?" Thomas asked gently, already suspecting the answer from the way she spoke in past tense. "Dead," Sarah said flatly, though fresh tears betrayed her pain. 3 months ago. Sickness took him and many others in our village. I tried to stay, but there was nothing left. No food, no help coming. The government agent said we must move to the reservation lands further north, but I heard stories about that place. Children dying, people starving. I decided to take my daughter and try to find somewhere safe. Thomas listened as he continued to work on Little Dawn. Slowly, color was returning to the child's face. Her breathing became more regular, and to his relief she began to whimper softly. It was the most beautiful sound he had heard in a long time. "She's going to be all right," Thomas said, carefully placing the now warming child back in her mother's arms. "But she needs food and rest. So do you." He moved to the kitchen area and began preparing a simple meal. There was soup left over from his own dinner, and he heated it on the stove. He sliced bread from a loaf and poured milk into 2 cups. It was not much, but it was warm and nourishing. As Sarah ate slowly, feeding small spoonfuls to Little Dawn, who had awakened and was watching Thomas with wide, curious eyes, she began to tell her story. She spoke of a life that had been full of love despite hardship. Her husband had been a skilled hunter and a kind man. They had lived in a small village that tried to maintain the old ways while adapting to the new reality of white settlement all around them. But disease had come, as it so often did, to native communities. With no immunity to the white man's illnesses and no access to proper medicine, people had fallen sick and died quickly. Sarah's husband had been among them. She had nursed him until the end, and then had to watch as others in the village suffered the same fate. "I walked for 6 days, Sarah said quietly, staring into the fire. "I had a little food at first, but it ran out. I begged at some houses, but most doors stayed closed. Some people threw stones and told us to leave. One man gave us bread but said we could not stay. I kept walking because I did not know what else to do. Then I saw your house, with smoke from the chimney, and I thought perhaps I would ask one more time for help." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest as he listened. He had heard stories like this before, but hearing it directly from someone sitting in his home, holding her child, made it real in a way that distant tales never could. "You can stay the night," Thomas said firmly, "and tomorrow we will see what comes next. For now, you both need rest." He prepared the spare bedroom, the one that had belonged to him and Margaret before her death. He had moved to a smaller room afterward, unable to sleep in the bed they had shared. The room had remained mostly unused, but it was clean and warm. He placed fresh linens on the bed and added extra blankets. Sarah tucked Little Dawn into the bed and climbed in beside her. The child was already falling asleep, her tiny hand clutching her mother's finger. Sarah looked up at Thomas with eyes that held more gratitude than words could express. "Thank you," she whispered. "May the Great Spirit bless you for your kindness." Thomas nodded and quietly closed the door. He returned to the main room and sat in his chair by the fire, staring into the dancing flames. He thought about Margaret and what she would have done in this situation. She had always had a kind heart and had often chided him for being too closed off from others. She would have welcomed Sarah and Little Dawn without hesitation. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and snow began to fall heavily. Thomas looked toward the bedroom door and made a decision that would change everything. One night of shelter was not enough. He could see that clearly now. Sarah and her daughter had nowhere to go, and winter was just beginning. What would happen to them if he sent them away in the morning? Morning arrived with a blanket of fresh snow covering the ranch. Thomas woke early, as he always did, the habits of a lifetime impossible to break even when his mind was heavy with thoughts. He dressed quietly and made his way to the kitchen, starting a fire in the stove to warm the house and prepare breakfast. The familiar routine brought him comfort, though this morning felt different. There were 2 other souls sleeping under his roof, and that changed everything. He prepared a large pot of oatmeal and set coffee to brew. The smell of food cooking filled the house, and soon he heard the soft sounds of movement from the spare bedroom. Sarah emerged first, her long hair braided neatly, wearing the same worn dress from the night before. She looked rested but uncertain, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected to find that the kindness of the previous night had been a dream. "Good morning," Thomas said, keeping his voice gentle. "I hope you both slept well." "Better than we have in many weeks," Sarah replied, moving closer to the warmth of the stove. "Little Dawn is still sleeping. She was warm through the night for the first time in so long." Thomas ladled oatmeal into bowls and set them on the table. He had added dried berries and a touch of honey, making the simple meal more appealing. Sarah sat down hesitantly, as if unsure whether she was truly welcome to take a seat at his table. "Please, eat," Thomas encouraged her. "You need your strength." As Sarah ate, Thomas noticed details he had missed the night before. Her dress was not just worn but carefully mended in several places, the stitching neat and precise. Her hands, though roughened by hard work, moved with grace. There was a dignity about her that poverty and hardship had not erased. She was a woman who had known better days and carried herself with the memory of them. "I must leave today," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "I have imposed on your kindness long enough. You gave us shelter for the night as I asked, and I am grateful beyond words." Thomas set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. He had been thinking about this moment since he woke, turning over the words in his mind, trying to find the right way to say what needed to be said. "Where will you go?" he asked simply. Sarah's hand stilled on her spoon. She looked down at her bowl, and Thomas could see her struggling with the answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know. Perhaps to the next town. Perhaps someone there will need help with cooking or washing. I can work hard. I can earn enough to keep us fed and find a place to stay." Thomas knew the reality she would face. A native woman with a small child in the dead of winter, with no connections and no resources, would find few doors open to her. The prejudice that existed in these territories was not something he could ignore or pretend did not exist. She might find work, but it would be poorly paid and unstable. She and little Dawn would likely struggle to survive, moving from place to place, always one misfortune away from disaster. "I have a proposal," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "My ranch is successful, but it is a lot of work for one man. I could use help with the household tasks, cooking, mending, keeping things in order. The ranch hands take care of the outdoor work, but the house has been neglected since my wife passed. If you were willing to stay and help with these things, I could provide room and board for you and your daughter. A fair wage as well?" Sarah looked up at him, surprise and suspicion mixing in her dark eyes. She had learned to be wary of offers that seemed too generous, especially for men she did not know. "You would let us stay here? In your home?" she asked carefully. "I would," Thomas confirmed. "The spare room would be yours. You would have privacy and safety. Little Dawn would have warmth and regular meals. In return, you would help maintain the household. It would be an arrangement of mutual benefit, nothing more." He spoke the last words firmly, wanting her to understand that he expected nothing improper from this arrangement. He was offering work and shelter, a business arrangement, not something that would compromise her dignity or safety. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception or hidden intentions. Thomas met her gaze steadily, letting her see the sincerity in his eyes. He understood her caution and respected it. "Why would you do this?" Sarah asked finally. "You do not know us. My people and your people do not often help each other in this way." Thomas considered the question. It was fair and deserved an honest answer. "My wife used to say that we are judged not by what we have, but by what we do with what we have," he said slowly. "I have this house, this land, more food than one man needs. You and your daughter need help. It seems simple to me. As for your people and mine, I judge individuals by their character, not by the color of their skin or the language they were born speaking. You came to my door asking for one night of shelter. You were respectful and grateful. Your daughter is innocent and deserving of a chance at life. That is all I need to know." A small sound from the bedroom interrupted their conversation. Little Dawn had awakened and was calling for her mother. Sarah rose quickly and went to the child, returning a moment later with the little girl on her hip. Little Dawn looked much better than she had the night before. Her cheeks had color, and her eyes were bright and alert. She stared at Thomas with open curiosity, one finger in her mouth. "This is Mr. Mackenzie," Sarah told her daughter softly. "He gave us food and a warm place to sleep. Can you say thank you?" Little Dawn buried her face in her mother's neck, suddenly shy, but Thomas saw her peek at him from behind her mother's hair. He smiled at her gently, remembering how his wife had always had a way with children, even though they had never been blessed with their own. "She does not need to thank me," Thomas said. Let her have some breakfast. Children should not worry about adult matters. Sarah fed her daughter oatmeal, blowing on each spoonful to cool it. The simple act of a mother caring for her child filled the kitchen with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. Thomas found himself watching them, feeling something shift inside his chest. The house had been so empty for so long. Having life and purpose within these walls felt right in a way he had not expected. After breakfast, Thomas showed Sarah around the house properly. There was the main room with the fireplace and his chair, the kitchen area with the stove and cupboards, the 2 bedrooms, and a small washroom. The house was solidly built but showed signs of neglect. Dust had gathered in corners, curtains needed washing, and many small repairs had been postponed because Thomas simply did not have the time or inclination to deal with them. As you can see, there is plenty of work if you are willing, Thomas said. I am not expecting perfection. Just someone to help keep things livable and prepare meals. I eat simple food, nothing fancy required. Sarah nodded, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. Thomas could see the wheels turning in her mind, seeing the house not as it was, but as it could be, with proper care. I can do this work, Sarah said with quiet confidence. I kept my own home before, and I helped my mother and grandmother before that. I know how to cook, clean, sew, and preserve food. I can make soap and candles. I can do many things. I do not doubt it, Thomas replied. So, is it agreed? You will stay and help with the household, and in return, you and little Dawn will have a home here, at least through the winter. When spring comes, if you wish to move on, you are free to do so. But you will not be turned out into the cold. Sarah looked down at her daughter, who was now playing with a wooden spoon on the floor, completely unaware of the decision being made that would determine her future. Sarah thought of the long, cold walk, the doors that had closed in her face, the uncertain and dangerous road that lay ahead if she left this place. Then she looked at Thomas, at his weathered but honest face, at the home he was offering. It is agreed, Sarah said, extending her hand in the white man's custom of sealing a deal. I will work hard for you, Mr. Mackenzie. You will not regret this kindness. Thomas shook her hand, her grip surprisingly firm despite her small size. Please call me Thomas, and I am sure I will not regret it. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity. Sarah insisted on beginning her work immediately, saying it would not be right to accept his generosity without earning it. Thomas tried to tell her to rest another day, but she was determined. He recognized the need in her to prove herself, to show that she was not a burden but a contributor. She started by cleaning the kitchen thoroughly, scrubbing surfaces that had only received cursory attention for months. She washed dishes and organized cupboards, finding places for everything and making mental notes of supplies that were running low. Little Dawn played nearby, content to be in her mother's presence and warm for the first time in recent memory. Thomas went about his own work, checking on the cattle with his ranch hands and making sure the animals had adequate shelter and food for the winter. When he returned to the house at midday, he was surprised to find it transformed. The floors had been swept, surfaces cleaned, and a pot of stew was simmering on the stove, filling the house with a rich, savory aroma that made his stomach growl with anticipation. You have been busy, he commented, impressed by how much she had accomplished in just a few hours. There is much more to do, Sarah replied, stirring the stew. But it is a good start. Over the next several days, a routine began to establish itself. Thomas rose early and went about his ranch work. Sarah took care of the house and prepared meals. Little Dawn slowly began to come out of her shell, her natural curiosity returning as she felt safe and secure. She would toddle around the house, exploring every corner, occasionally bringing Thomas something she found interesting, a button or a pine cone, holding it up for his inspection with a proud smile. The ranch hands, a man named Jack and his 2 sons, Peter and Michael, were surprised to find a native woman and child living in the main house. Jack, who had worked for Thomas for 5 years, approached him privately. One evening, "Boss, is everything all right?" Jack asked carefully. "The woman and child, they are staying?" "They are," Thomas confirmed. "Sarah is helping with household work. She and her daughter needed a place, and I needed help. It is a fair arrangement." Jack nodded slowly, processing this information. "Some folks in town might have opinions about it," he said cautiously. "Some folks always have opinions," Thomas replied firmly. "What happens on my ranch is my business. Sarah is under my protection now. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." Jack smiled slightly at that. He had always respected Thomas for his fairness and his strength of character. "Understood, boss. Just wanted to make sure we were all clear. The boys and I will treat her and the little one with respect." "I would expect nothing less," Thomas said. Word did eventually reach town about the arrangement at the Mackenzie Ranch. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, heard about it from her son, who delivered supplies. She mentioned it to Mrs. Carleton, the minister's wife, who mentioned it to several other ladies. Soon, the topic was being discussed over tea and after church services. Spring arrived on the Montana plains with a gentle persistence that seemed to wash away the harshness of winter. The snow melted into rushing streams, wildflowers began to dot the grasslands with splashes of color, and the air carried the promise of new beginnings. For Thomas Mackenzie, the changing season brought with it a realization that he had been avoiding for weeks. His arrangement with Sarah and little Dawn, which he had initially framed as temporary, had become something he could no longer imagine living without. The household had transformed completely under Sarah's care. The ranch house was no longer just a place where Thomas ate and slept between long days of work. It had become a home again, filled with the sounds of life and laughter. Little Dawn's voice calling out discoveries, Sarah's gentle singing as she worked, the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, all of these things had woven themselves into the fabric of daily existence until Thomas could not remember what it had been like before they arrived. Sarah had proven herself to be far more than just a housekeeper. She had a sharp mind for organization and had helped Thomas keep better records of his cattle and expenses. She had planted a kitchen garden near the house, carefully selecting seeds and planning what would grow best in the Montana soil. She had mended not just clothes but also saddles and harnesses, her skilled hands able to work with leather as well as fabric. The ranch hands had grown to respect her, often asking her advice on various matters and always speaking to her with courtesy. Little Dawn had blossomed like the spring flowers. The frightened, half-frozen child who had arrived in the dead of winter was now an energetic 3-year-old who followed Thomas around the ranch whenever he allowed it. She had learned to feed the chickens, to gently pet the horses, and to spot cattle in the distant fields. Her laughter was a constant presence, bright and pure, and Thomas found himself smiling more often than he had in years. But with the arrival of spring came the memory of their agreement. Thomas had promised Sarah that when the weather warmed, if she wished to move on, she would be free to do so. He had given his word, and he was a man who kept his promises. Yet the thought of them leaving created a hollow ache in his chest that he tried desperately to ignore. One morning in early April, as Sarah prepared breakfast, Thomas noticed she seemed distracted. She moved through her tasks efficiently, as always, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. Little Dawn was playing outside under the watchful eye of young Peter, who had taken a particular liking to the child and often carved small wooden toys for her. "Is something troubling you?" Thomas asked, setting down his coffee cup. Sarah paused in her work, her hands stilling on the bread dough she had been kneading. She did not turn to face him immediately, and when she finally did, Thomas could see uncertainty in her eyes. "Spring is here," she said simply. "When I came to your door that winter night, you said I could stay through the winter. You have kept your word and given us far more than we could have hoped for. The weather is warm now. The roads are clear. It is time for us to think about what comes next." Thomas felt his heart sink, though he kept his expression neutral. "Do you wish to leave?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "I do not know what I wish," Sarah admitted, sitting down at the table across from him. "I am grateful for everything you have done for us. You saved our lives, Thomas. Without your kindness, little Dawn and I would not have survived the winter. You have treated us with respect and fairness. You have given us safety and a home. But I also know this arrangement was meant to be temporary." "It was," Thomas agreed carefully. "But arrangements can change if both parties wish them to change." Sarah looked at him intently, trying to read his meaning. "What are you saying?" Thomas took a deep breath. This was a conversation he had been rehearsing in his mind for weeks, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt clumsy and inadequate. "I am saying that I would like you and little Dawn to stay," he said plainly. "Not as a temporary arrangement, but permanently. This is your home now, if you want it to be. You have earned your place here many times over, but more than that, I have grown accustomed to having you both here. The house feels right with you in it. Little Dawn brings joy to days that used to feel empty. You both belong here." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and Thomas could see her processing his words. He pressed on, wanting to make his intentions completely clear. "I am not asking for anything to change between us," he added quickly. "The arrangement would remain as it is. You would continue to have your own room, your privacy, your independence. I simply want you to know that you and your daughter have a permanent home here for as long as you wish to stay. There is no obligation to leave just because winter has passed." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she blinked them back, trying to maintain her composure. You would let us stay? Truly? Not just for another season, but always? Always, Thomas confirmed. I give you my word. Sarah wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. You are a good man, Thomas Mackenzie. A better man than most I have known, white or native. Little Dawn and I would be honored to make this our home. A smile spread across Thomas's face, genuine and relieved. Then it is settled. This is your home. The news brought joy not just to the household, but also to the ranch hands, who had grown fond of Sarah and Little Dawn. Jack even organized a small celebration that evening, bringing out his fiddle and playing lively tunes while they all gathered around a bonfire. Little Dawn danced with uninhibited delight, her small feet stomping in time with the music while the adults clapped and cheered her on. However, not everyone in the community was pleased with the permanence of the arrangement. Mrs. Carleton, the minister's wife, felt it was her duty to address what she saw as a moral concern. She organized a small delegation of churchwomen to visit the Mackenzie Ranch one afternoon, ostensibly to bring baked goods, but really to investigate the situation firsthand. Thomas was out checking fence lines when the women arrived, so Sarah greeted them at the door. She invited them in politely, offering tea and seats by the fire, though she sensed immediately that this was not a friendly social call. Mrs. Carleton got straight to the point, after the briefest of pleasantries. My dear, we have heard that you have been living here with Mr. Mackenzie for several months now. We are concerned about the propriety of such an arrangement. Sarah kept her expression calm and her voice respectful. Mr. Mackenzie has been very kind to my daughter and me. He gave us shelter when we had nowhere else to go. I work for him, keeping his house and preparing his meals. It is an employment arrangement, nothing more. Yes, but you live under the same roof as an unmarried man, Mrs. Henderson added, her voice dripping with false concern. People talk, you understand. It does not look proper, regardless of the actual circumstances. What people think is not something I can control, Sarah replied evenly. I know the truth of the situation, as does Mr. Mackenzie. We have both conducted ourselves with complete propriety. Mrs. Carleton leaned forward, her expression one of practiced sympathy. Of course, dear, we are not questioning your character. But you must understand that appearances matter. For your sake, and for your daughter's sake, perhaps it would be better if you found a position elsewhere, perhaps with a family where there are other women present. We could help you find such a position. Sarah understood what was really being offered. They wanted to remove her from Thomas's house and place her somewhere they could supervise, somewhere that fit their narrow view of what was acceptable. The thought of leaving the home she had come to love, of taking Little Dawn away from the safety and security they had found here, filled her with quiet determination. I appreciate your concern, Sarah said, her voice firm but polite, but I am quite content with my current situation. Mr. Mackenzie has been nothing but respectful and honorable. This is my home now, and I have no intention of leaving. The women exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such direct resistance. Before they could formulate another argument, the door opened, and Thomas entered, dusty from his work, but immediately alert to the tense atmosphere in the room. Ladies, he greeted them with a polite nod. To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit? Mrs. Carleton stood, smoothing her skirts. Mr. Mackenzie, we were just expressing some concerns about the living arrangements here. Surely you can understand that having an unmarried woman living in your home raises questions. Thomas's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained civil. Sarah works for me. She earns her keep through honest labor. The arrangement is purely professional, and frankly, it is nobody's business but ours.
But Mr. Mackenzie, Mrs. Ward,
Henderson interjected. Think of your reputation. Think of the child. People in town are talking. Let them talk, Thomas said firmly. I have never been one to make my decisions based on gossip. Sarah and Little Dawn are under my protection. They have a home here for as long as they wish to stay. I will not ask them to leave to satisfy the curiosity or judgment of others. Mrs. Carleton drew herself up to her full height, clearly offended by his dismissive tone. We are only trying to help, Mr. Mackenzie. There are proper ways to do things. And I am doing things my way, Thomas replied, moving to hold the door open in a clear gesture of dismissal. Thank you for your visit, ladies. Good day. The women left in a flutter of indignation, their baked goods forgotten on the table. After they departed, Thomas closed the door and turned to Sarah, who stood with her hands clasped tightly together. I am sorry, Sarah said quietly. I have brought trouble to your door. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps it would be better if Little Dawn and I left. Absolutely not, Thomas said with conviction. You are staying, and that is final. Those women have too much time on their hands, and too little understanding in their hearts. Pay them no mind. But your reputation? Sarah protested. What they said about people talking. Thomas moved closer, looking directly into her eyes. Sarah, my reputation is built on 30 years of honest work and fair dealing. Anyone who knows me knows my character. Those who would judge me based on malicious gossip were never truly friends to begin with. You and little Dawn are part of this household now. Nothing and no one will change that. Sarah felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by his steadfast support. Why do you defend us so strongly? We are nothing to you, just a woman and child you took pity on one winter night. You are not nothing, Thomas said gently. You have become important to me, both of you. This house was just a building before you arrived. You made it a home again. Little Dawn's laughter, your presence, the life you both bring to this place. These things matter to me more than the opinions of judgmental churchwomen. That evening, after Little Dawn was asleep and the house was quiet, Sarah and Thomas sat by the fire as they often did, discussing the day's events and planning for tomorrow. The confrontation with the town women hung in the air between them, unresolved. I worry about Little Dawn, Sarah admitted softly. Not now, but in the future. She will grow up here, but she is different. She will face judgment and cruelty because of who she is. I have tried to protect her from that, but I cannot protect her from everything. Thomas stared into the fire, thinking carefully about his response. No parent can protect their child from all harm. But you can give her a foundation of love and security to stand on when she faces difficulties. She has that here. She has you, and she has me, and she has people like Jack and his boys who care about her. That is more than many children have. 2 years had passed since that spring conversation, and the Mackenzie ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as the changing seasons. Little Dawn was now 5 years old, bright and curious, helping her mother with small tasks around the house and following Thomas like a shadow whenever he would allow it. The child had grown strong and healthy, her laughter a constant melody that filled the air around the ranch. Sarah had become indispensable not just to the household, but to the entire operation of the ranch. She had proven to have a keen understanding of finances, helping Thomas organize his accounts and plan for future investments. Her garden had expanded each year, providing fresh vegetables throughout the summer and preserved foods for the winter. She had even begun raising chickens and selling eggs in town, creating her own small income that gave her a sense of independence and pride. The relationship between Sarah and Thomas had deepened into something neither of them had anticipated. It was built on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and countless quiet evenings by the fire discussing everything from ranch business to philosophy to their dreams for the future. They had become true partners, though neither had spoken aloud about the feelings that had grown between them. Thomas found himself thinking about Sarah at odd moments throughout his day. The way she hummed while she worked, the gentle patience she showed with Little Dawn, the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes when they discussed complex matters, the quiet strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardships. He admired her, respected her, and if he was honest with himself, he had fallen in love with her. But he hesitated to speak of these feelings, fearing that he might make her uncomfortable or that she might feel obligated to reciprocate because of their living arrangement. Sarah, for her part, had similar thoughts. Thomas had shown her a kindness and respect she had rarely experienced. He had given her and her daughter not just shelter, but a true home. He treated her as an equal, valued her opinions, and protected her from those who would judge or harm them. He had become Little Dawn's father figure, patient and kind, teaching the child about the ranch and the world with a gentleness that touched Sarah's heart. She found herself imagining what it might be like if their relationship became something more, but she too remained silent, not wanting to presume or to risk the stability they had built. The town's attitude toward the arrangement at the Mackenzie ranch had evolved gradually. The initial scandal and gossip had faded as people grew accustomed to the situation. Thomas's unwavering support of Sarah and his continued success with the ranch had eventually won over even some of his harshest critics. The fact that Sarah conducted herself with dignity and that Little Dawn was clearly thriving had made it difficult for people to maintain their outrage. However, there were still those who disapproved, and occasionally that disapproval manifested in unpleasant ways. One afternoon in late summer, Sarah took Little Dawn to town for supplies. They visited the general store, where Mrs. Henderson had grown civil, if not exactly warm. As they were leaving with their purchases, they encountered a group of men outside the saloon. One of them, a ranch hand from a neighboring property known for his rough behavior and prejudiced views, called out to Sarah, "Well, look here, boys. It's Mackenzie's Indian woman. Tell me, sweetheart, what exactly do you do to earn your keep at that ranch?" His companions laughed, the insinuation clear and insulting. Sarah felt her face grow hot with anger and humiliation, but she kept her head high and continued walking, holding Little Dawn's hand tightly. She would not give these men the satisfaction of a response. I'm talking to you, the man called again, stepping into her path. It ain't natural, a woman like you living with a white man. Everybody knows what that means, even if Mackenzie pretends otherwise. Before Sarah could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension like a knife. Step away from her, Hutchins. Thomas had been across the street at the blacksmith's shop and had seen the confrontation developing. He strode toward them with purposeful steps, his face set in hard lines. Jack and his sons, who had been loading supplies onto a wagon, also moved closer, forming a protective semicircle around Sarah and Little Dawn. Hutchins tried to maintain his bravado, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. Thomas Mackenzie was known as a fair man, but he was also known as someone you did not want to cross. We were just having a conversation, Mackenzie. No harm meant. You were insulting a lady, Thomas said coldly, and frightening a child. I suggest you apologize and then go about your business. Apologize? To her? Hutchins scoffed, though he took a small step backward. She's just finish that sentence and you will regret it, Thomas interrupted, his voice deadly calm. Sarah White Eagle is a respectable woman who works for me and lives under my protection. Anyone who insults her insults me. Now, you can apologize like a civilized human being, or you can deal with the consequences of your behavior. The tension was thick enough to cut off. Hutchins looked at his companions for support, but they had gone quiet, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond simple harassment. Several townspeople had stopped to watch, and Hutchins seemed to realize that he had overstepped. I meant no offense, he muttered, though the words were clearly forced. That is not an apology, Thomas said firmly. Try again, and this time, direct your words to the lady you insulted. Hutchins clenched his jaw, but finally turned to Sarah. My apologies, ma'am. I spoke out of turn. Sarah nodded once, acknowledging the apology without warmth. Thomas placed a protective hand on her shoulder and guided her and Little Dawn away from the confrontation. Jack and his sons followed, creating a barrier between them and Hutchins until they reached their wagon. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Little Dawn sat between them, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its source. She held her mother's hand and leaned against Thomas, trusting both of them to keep her safe. Once they arrived home and Little Dawn was occupied with her toys, Sarah finally spoke what had been building inside her since the incident in town. This will never stop, she said, her voice thick with frustration and sadness. There will always be people like Hutchins who see me as something less, who assume the worst about our arrangement. I cannot protect Little Dawn from this kind of cruelty forever. Perhaps we should consider moving somewhere else, somewhere we are not known. Thomas had been dreading this conversation, fearing that eventually the weight of social disapproval would become too heavy to bear. But hearing Sarah speak of leaving crystallize something inside him gave him the courage to finally say what he had been feeling for so long. Or, he said slowly, we could give them nothing to gossip about. Sarah looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything between them one way or another. Sarah, these past 2 years have been the happiest of my life since Margaret passed. You and Little Dawn have brought light and purpose back into my world. When I imagine my future, I cannot imagine it without both of you in it. I have feelings for you that go beyond employer and employee, beyond landlord and tenant, beyond even friendship. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped in her private moments that Thomas might feel something for her, but she had never dared to assume. Thomas continued, his words coming faster now as if a dam had broken. I love you, Sarah. I love your strength, your intelligence, your kindness, your grace. I love the way you sing while you work and the way you laugh at Little Dawn's antics. I love the conversations we have by the fire and the way you challenge me to think differently about the world. I am asking, if you could possibly feel the same way, would you consider becoming my wife? Not to stop gossip or to make things easier socially, but because I genuinely want to spend the rest of my life with you. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but they were tears of joy mixed with relief and love. Thomas, I have loved you for longer than I care to admit. I was afraid to say anything, afraid that you might think I was trying to trap you or take advantage of your kindness. You have given me so much already, I did not dare to hope for more. Thomas reached out and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. Then you will marry me? You will let me be a true father to Little Dawn, and perhaps, if we are blessed, we might have more children together? Yes, Sarah whispered. Yes, I will marry you. There is nothing I want more. They married quietly 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. The minister from town, a kind man who had always treated Sarah with respect, agreed to perform the service. Jack and his son stood as witnesses along with a few friends from neighboring ranches who had proven themselves accepting and supportive. Little Dawn, wearing a new dress that Sarah had sewn specially for the occasion, stood beside her mother and beamed with happiness when Thomas officially became her father. The marriage was legal and binding, though Thomas had consulted with a lawyer to ensure that everything was done properly to protect Sarah and Little Dawn. He had his will updated to ensure that if anything happened to him, Sarah would inherit the ranch and all his assets. He wanted to make sure they would always be provided for, that they would never again face the uncertainty and hardship that had brought Sarah to his door that winter night. The news of the marriage rippled through the community, creating varying reactions. Some people were scandalized, others were accepting, and a few were even supportive. Miss Carlton and her circle of church ladies were predictably disapproving, but their influence had waned over the years, and most people had grown tired of their judgment. More importantly, Thomas and Sarah did not concern themselves overly with public opinion. They had each other, they had Little Dawn, they had their home, and they had the love and respect that had grown between them. That was enough. Life on the ranch continued much as it had before, but with a deeper sense of security and belonging. Sarah was no longer an employee or a guest. She was the lady of the house, Thomas's wife, and Little Dawn's mother in every sense. She flourished in this role, her confidence growing as she realized that her place in this family and on this land was permanent and unshakable. Little Dawn thrived under the love of both her parents. Thomas officially adopted her, giving her his name and all the legal protections that came with it. She would grow up knowing both her native heritage, which Sarah made sure to teach her, and the ranching culture of Montana. She would learn to be proud of who she was, to stand tall in the face of prejudice, and to judge people by their character rather than their appearance. 2 years after their marriage, Sarah gave birth to a son. They named him James, after Thomas's father. Little Dawn was enchanted with her baby brother and took her role as big sister very seriously. The family expanded again 18 months later with the birth of a daughter they named Margaret, after Thomas's first wife. Sarah had suggested the name, wanting to honor the woman whose death had left the space that she now filled. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Thomas's skill with cattle and land management, combined with Sarah's financial acumen and organizational abilities, made them a formidable team. They expanded their holdings, purchased more cattle, and built a reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock. As the years passed, the community's attitude continued to shift. Younger people who had grown up seeing the Mackenzie family as normal and unremarkable replaced the older generation who had been scandalized by the marriage. Little Dawn grew into a beautiful and confident young woman who commanded respect through her intelligence and character. James and Margaret grew up knowing only love and acceptance within their family, though they learned early about the prejudices that existed in the wider world. On a spring evening, 15 years after that fateful winter night when Sarah had first knocked on his door, Thomas sat on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant colors. Sarah sat beside him, her hand in his, their fingers intertwined in the comfortable way of couples who have been together for many years. Little Dawn, now a young woman of 20, rode past on horseback, checking on the cattle in the near pasture. James and Margaret played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The ranch was thriving, the family was healthy and happy, and the home was filled with love. "Do you ever think about that night?" Thomas asked softly. "The night you came to my door asking for shelter?" Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "Every day. I think about how frightened I was, how desperate. I thought I was asking for one night of kindness. I never imagined I would find a lifetime of love. I was so lonely," Thomas admitted. "I did not even realize how lonely until you and Little Dawn arrived. You saved me as much as I saved you that night. We saved each other," Sarah corrected gently. "And we built something beautiful together. A family, a home, a life, all from one act of kindness on a cold winter night." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their children and their land, grateful for the courage it had taken to open that door all those years ago, and for every day since that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. The widow who had begged for one night of shelter had indeed received forever of protection, but more than that, she had found forever of love.